Just gonna give this a minute and give people a second to log in. Welcome, welcome. I'll get started with a quick introduction. I want to thank you all for joining us. My name's Allason Leitz. I'm a programmer and the cinema manager here at Maysles Documentary Center. We are thrilled to have this panel with us today. It's centered around dementia and care, but certainly also includes the film that I'm sure some of you have seen already, called Some of My Parts, from filmmaker Chris Bravo, who's with us today as well. The discussion will be recorded and available online afterwards. I'll send a link out to those of you joining us today. Please feel free to join it, to watch the link later, send it on to your friends. We very much appreciate that. Another exciting event that's coming up later this week is a discussion with filmmaker Christoph Bilson. He has a film called Mother, which is also a different sort of take on dementia care and Alzheimer's. So we are very excited to have that. That'll be on December 3rd, Thursday, and recorded as well. Today we have on the panel Chris Bravo, who's a filmmaker and who's working on other projects as well related to dementia that are forthcoming. We've got Lynn Casteel Harper, who is a writer, minister, and a chaplain, and she is just recently published her book On Vanishing, which is about dementia, as well as being the current minister of older adults at Riverside Church in the city of New York. And last but not least, Sonja Shute, who is the senior director at PSS Circle of Care. We are thrilled to have you all with us, and I can't wait to see where this conversation goes. So thank you so much for taking the time, and I'm gonna pass it on to Chris, the virtual baton.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Allison, for hosting the panel, and thanks to the Maysles Center, which is like such a great film organization like here in New York. And so I'm super happy that we were sort of like able to kind of put this discussion together and like have you guys host it. Like that's it's really great. And also thanks to like Lynn and Sonja for agreeing to be on the panel. Like their work is totally amazing, and so like they're gonna definitely like talk a little bit about what they're doing, and hopefully we'll have like time for like some questions and discussions. But like I think that people can just sort of ping questions indirectly into the Q&A feed or in the chat, or Allison just left. But hopefully, so basically, I just would like to maybe kind of first start out by talking a little bit about the film and about how it came about, and like my relationship with my mom, and sort of some of the ideas that I was really kind of interested in exploring with the film. And so I'm a documentary filmmaker, and I've been working in documentary for a while. And when it's hard, I can't really remember which kind of came first, like whether I started, whether my mom kind of started to kind of present with some symptoms of cognitive impairment, or if I had sort of gotten into kind of like the caregiving world, like kind of like more a little bit organically through other work that I was doing. But those things, I think that probably kind of happened simultaneously. I was actually working on a project that had an interview with Ai-jen Poo, who is she's the director of like this really amazing organization called the Domestic Workers Alliance. And she was like sort of talking about caregiving in like this really super powerful kind of like abstract way, and about like this incredible role that caregiving could play in sort of like this larger movement about like social justice, and a larger movement about thinking about civil rights. And that seemed to me totally true. Like I felt that, that the caregiving community that included caregivers, like professional caregivers, like institutions, and also the people, who were receiving care, kind of like formed a community that was really very interesting. It was like kind of very like a diverse community. And that kind of brought a lot of like interesting questions to the table, like around like race, around immigration, around disability, and around like how how do we sort of support each other and kind of come together as a community and really kind of start thinking about like how we can sort of address and support each other's needs. And so while that was kind of going on, my mom, who is, I grew up, like she was a single mom. And so like she is like my parent. And she's also like a very kind of like intelligent, very smart, very sort of verbal person. And and so then I started on my own kind of caregiving journey, like with her, because she started to like have health problems. And then as we started to kind of get into and unravel like what those issues were, like this the issue around cognitive parent kind of started to become like the focus of that. And that, and I'm sure that if there are kind of caregivers like in the audience here can understand that that can be like a very challenging, kind of somewhat traumatic, somewhat difficult time. Like as like these relationships that you have with people that you've known your entire life begin to really sort of shift. And so my mom was like living in Bethesda at the time, and I was like living up in here in New York. And so for a couple of years, my life was just basically a series of like every 6 to 8 weeks, like having to like go down to DC and kind of take care of like some issue, some bank account that was, some doctor's appointment. And so it was like a very sort of a strange time, because I was struggling with my relationship with her. And I think what was even more kind of impactful on me was that I saw her struggling with her relationship with herself. And I saw her trying to really kind of fight against this process that was happening inside her head, and which is a futile fight. You can't fight against it, but it was just heartbreaking to kind of go into her house and just see like books. There would be like stacks of books like on kitchen tables and on coffee tables of like instruction guides, because she could feel that her kind of cognitive capacity was starting to shift. And so she would try to overcompensate by like really kind of studying instruction manuals to try to figure out like how to sort of make her insulin pump work. She also has type 1 diabetes, which is very kind of a complicated situation as well. And that was tough for me to sort of witness. And I think now, after actually like having read Lynn's book, On Vanishing, which I highly recommend, it's totally amazing. And so I'm just going to borrow a little bit of her language, but I didn't kind of come to that book until like later, was that there was something very, like, I felt that there was something unknown happening in her and in the house that was really, that kind of frightened me. And that really made it feel, made me kind of be hesitant to really kind of engage with what was kind of going on with her. And so we really we struggled for like a year or two like that. But then, we got ourselves like onto a good road of sort of stabilizing that situation and sort of like having the drama level sort of drop over time. And when we did that, and I was able to kind of take a step back, and I was able to re-find a kind of a verbal kind of connection with her, because I could actually just sit there and we could just talk. We could sort of chit chat, and I could sort of ask her questions about how she was feeling. I could ask her questions about, that were more abstract, like something more along the lines of what our kind of quote unquote normal conversation would be. And, and I started to like really kind of like reconnect. And so I felt that even though that there was like a progress of the disease that was sort of like happening in one direction, that there was also, to, borrow and also a term for Lynn, there was like kind of a reintegration of something that was actually kind of coming back together, that as I was able to kind of like reestablish an open line of communication with her. And, and since I was a filmmaker, and I was kind of also kind of interested in working on a project about caregiving, like it seemed to be obvious. It didn't really, it was honestly kind of suggested to me by a friend of mine, because, she thought that like, would be a big mistake not to like actually kind of record and shoot these conversations with her, even though I wasn't sure really what I wanted to do with them. I thought there were a lot of questions about like recording and filming her. I wasn't sure whether she would be open to that, and so it was definitely at a point where it was hard to kind of have a conversation with her about what that would mean to like have her voice be present in the public, to have this part of her story be told to people that she'd never met before. And so it was a journey of sort of figuring all of these things out. And then that, those conversations just kind of grew and started to amass. And so, which I was like, well, okay, this makes a good short film. So I'm not really somebody who has worked very much like on very kind of first person narrative kind of storytelling. And so this was really like the first film that I made that was really kind of like featured me as a kind of a close kind of subject like in the film. And so it sort of seemed like an interesting sort of position to be in, because like I felt that I had the kind of the authority because of my relationship with my mom, that I could take this kind of sensitive material and in a responsible way and in an accountable way, I think kind of present it to people, and I think open up a discussion like about like what that is like in this kind of private privileged space, which I think too often from caregivers, they feel like they're a little bit kind of like closed in. Like I feel like that people, at least from my perspective, from my own story, and also like from what I hear in caregiving support groups that I've been involved with is that people feel that their sort of narrative is really kind of separate from like everybody else's, and that there's not really very much of a kind of an openness to sort of experience. And so that was really kind of like what I basically wanted to kind of try to do with the film is to kind of get like into that private space with my mom, kind of as much as possible, having her sort of describe what she was going through like in her voice. And as somebody who, has been working in documentary film and who's also been kind of involved in different kinds of like activism and social justice movements, that sort of to me seems like very much like the foundation upon which all of that rest can be built. If a community needs to start speaking for itself, for those other things to kind of start happening, and until you can like really kind of like lay that foundation of like helping people find that voice, then there's really not very much that we can sort of like do on top of that. And I think that the question of like how are people with dementia able to speak their own story is an interesting question. And I think it's a question that I think specifically like culture workers are kind of in an amazing position to try to help like unravel, because I think that we're able to kind of like utilize tools like as artists to kind of find ways to engage people with dementia in the process of communication, in a process of building narratives, and then kind of finding form around those narratives to sort of get them out to people. And then, we then as a larger community can kind of take those stories and take those voices and really kind of like work with it and kind of, heal some of like the splits that I think unfortunately like have grown between like not just people with dementia, but also people with like the aging population at large, who I think kind of sometimes like are a bit marginalized and not included in sort of the our more mainstream culture. And so I can go on, but I want to sort of give Lynn and Sonja a chance to sort of talk a little bit about like kind of like what they're up to, and then hopefully, people will have questions, and then we can kind of like return, I think, and hopefully make some connections. But yeah, Lynn, do you want to talk a little bit about the book and where you sort of fit in?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Chris. Thanks for inviting me. It's such a pleasure to be on this panel. And I just want to say, watching your film again, I'd watched it months ago and then watched it again today. It's just so beautiful. And the way you weave in so much in 22 2 minutes is quite incredible. And something I was struck by, and something I've been working on for many years now, is your film started with your mother's voice. It didn't start with text or your voice saying, Mom was diagnosed with this, this, and this. And it was her voice, her observation. And throughout the film, I was just writing down her beautiful lines, and sometimes heartbreaking lines. But it was so much her voice. And I think that's rare, as you say, in our culture. We want to put a frame around it immediately. This person's sick, they're confused, or this is their diagnosis. But it was just such a humanizing way you framed it. And the very last line is, I love you, which again is so humanizing and life-giving. So thank you, Chris. I think our work intersects in a number of ways. When I first started in ministry many years ago, my first job was as a chaplain at a retirement community. And I was assigned to the dementia unit. I had 200 people in the whole facility, but the dementia unit was probably about 40 people. And I can remember on my first day there, getting a tour by a perfectly well-meaning, nice administrator. And when I got to the dementia unit, he told me, you probably won't spend much time here. And the message that was subtle and not so subtle is that these people aren't worth our time. We do nice things for them. We're nice enough, but we don't really listen to their voices like the way your film does. And we don't they're not worth our best energy and our most creative time and talents. And that just struck me. And what I found is that I ended up spending most of my time at the unit and getting to know people not as this sort of blur of disability, this kind of mass of nameless people with diagnosis, but as individuals with histories and life stories and vital things to share, and they needed people to receive it. And I think oftentimes what we assign to the disease is actually a manifestation of social isolation from people withdrawing from them, which creates the question, who is vanishing? Are they vanishing because of their memory loss, or are they vanishing because we're vanishing? Those of us who aren't there yet, we're withdrawing. We're because of our own fear or discomfort, not entering these spaces. And so I guess that initial tour was about a decade ago, and I ended up working for 7 years in that environment, and then continued to work with older adults and people with memory loss, and have been incredibly gifted by their presence in my life. And so, yes, we can talk about loss on one hand, and we should talk about loss and suffering. We don't downplay it, but on the other, what is being reintegrated? What is being, what new gifts or manifestations of someone's life might be possible in this time? And so, I'm really compelled by your sense of prioritizing her voice, Joyce's voice, showing the fullness of her life through her house. I loved seeing the old photos, her books, Jude the Obscure, all the different, it just made me have so many questions about who is this woman? I want to know her more. The pet bowls and the cat scratcher, I just can envision her life as a full one and not one just of a diagnosis. And so, yeah, I just appreciate that opportunity, Chris, to enter into that again.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, one of the ideas that, and I think that you kind of get to this in your book, is that I think one of the things that, we who don't have a dementia diagnosis, like we're confronted with like a very scary idea that many of like our kind of strongly held beliefs about like the strength of our own identity, the strength of our own kind of brain function, like it's really sort of undercut a little bit. And I think it kind of asks, it forces us to like really ask ourselves like really kind of important questions about, you know, about why, what makes me? I mean, it's really easy to sort of like say, just like, oh, well, of course, like I'm the, you know, I am the end result of an entire lifetime of like memories that build up, and like, and that's me, the present day. But you know, really what happens like if those things are taken away by you know, a disease or something else? Like, does that really undercut like like who I am as a person or my value like as a human being? And I think that we, you know, we understand that the answer to that is like no, but then it kind of puts us a little bit on a life raft of sort of like, well, then where does that, you know, like sort of like leave us? And you know, I was kind of flipping through like your book this morning, and I kind of came across like this kind of like this interesting story like at the beginning of your book that really just sort of jumped out at me, because I think it's something, because it just seemed to speak a lot in like a little bit. You're telling the story of your grandfather, who I think is the first person personally in your life to kind of come up with dementia. And you know, you're telling the story about how your grandmother passed away suddenly, and it was really with the absence of your grandmother that you kind of came face to face with your grandfather's dementia, because your grandmother, as like his primary caregiver, was really kind of overcompensating and protecting him and kind of supporting him and kind of like hiding those kinds of things that were sort of like going on and kind of protecting him. And it wasn't until that caregiver relationship was taken away that, you know, that this then kind of like it became something that had to deal with like the larger family unit, and had to kind of step in. And on the one hand, like it just sort of, it seemed to be an amazing kind of testimony to sort of the role that your grandmother was like playing in his life at that point as like a caregiver. But it also sort of pointed to a situation where, you know, why did it need to sort of be so contained like that? You know what I mean? Like what kind of support could your grandmother have tried to connect to or something like that? I mean, do you sort of think along those lines? Or
Yeah, you're right, Chris. It's like on one hand, she was so incredibly intelligent in many different ways to be able to caregive in such a comprehensive way, but it's also very isolating and sad for our family to realize how much she was carrying around, and then to die suddenly from a brain bleed. You know, just so much grief upon grief. And I felt that in your film too, like how isolated you are in this big house by yourself, going through the papers, no one's with you. And I think that's the experience of so many people. And I think perhaps particularly with dementia, because it's a stigmatized disease. People report losing friends when they share a diagnosis. You know, I don't think that's the case for other terminal conditions. You know, if someone tells you you have cancer, you know, there may be people who withdraw, but it's not quite the same. And so I'm sure Sonja sees that all the time in her work too, how caregivers feel that kind of distancing. And yeah, I'd love to create a culture where that's not the case.
yeah, and I know, and I mean, I think that this is sort of like where Sonja's work really does kind of like step in, and I think that, you know, for my, like what was kind of frustrating me kind of like entering into like that caregiving role was that like I felt like I had so much to learn, and it was really even hard to figure out like how to learn what I felt I needed to learn at that point. And, you know, and so like it was kind of a situation where I always kind of stumbled upon resources like sort of too late. And so, you know, it's like when I kind of first went to my first caregiver support group meeting, it was a good 2 years after I really needed to be in the caregiver support group meeting. And so, you know, and so like I remember like walking in, and after like 10 minutes was just like, oh my, like why, like I needed to do this like years ago. And, you know, this really would have changed the situation that, you know, for me and how I was kind of thinking about it. And so that like kind of, I think brings us to Sonja and like, and PSS that is just like a large ranging project that I think is designed to support not just caregivers, but also like people with dementia diagnoses themselves, and in New York. And can you talk a little bit about like sort of what you guys do?
Yes, absolutely. And just very quickly, thank you so much for this opportunity. I want to commend both of you. It's such an honor to even be part of this platform with you, and commend both of you on the incredible work you're doing. And Chris, your film was so incredibly powerful and touching. And I was so inspired how you took such a profound chapter in your life and channeled it in this way. And I was very, very much moved. And yes, I think you really touched on something, and that's the isolation that so many caregivers experience. Because oftentimes people find themselves going through this solo journey. And I think one of the reasons your film, one of the many reasons your film is particularly important and impactful right now is because you took what was really a very private experience, you know, in your mother's home and having private conversations with your mother, but yet now you've put it out in the, you know, into a public forum. And I think that's really it's a very powerful tool to address some of the isolation that so many caregivers experience. And, you know, I think oftentimes that's why, you know, we have support groups, but I think the important takeaway is facilitating the gathering of folks who are going through a similar experience. Because if, you know, I'm a caregiver for the first time, particularly caring for someone who's experiencing memory loss, if that's the first time I found myself in that role, that can be an incredibly overwhelming experience because there's so much to learn. But there's also a whole myriad of emotions that a caregiver is experiencing, right? It's a fulfilling role. But it can also be extremely overwhelming. You're going through a grieving process, and it's often a very prolonged grieving process. And then it can impact in your life in a way that, you know, you have to make adaptations, and sometimes people may start to feel all sorts of emotions around that. So I think it's really important that as a community, we're coming together and acknowledging all these experiences caregivers are having. Because it effectively functions to normalize that experience. And it's an incredibly powerful tool. So I really think, you know, I just want to acknowledge the significance of what you've created here. And then just very quickly, to talk a little bit more, PSS Circle of Care, for those who may not know, is a caregiver support program. So we provide support to caregivers that are caring for someone who is ill, elderly, frail, or experiencing memory loss. We do that in a number of different ways. One of them is through counseling, individual and family consultations. So anyone who's been in a caregiving role, often there's usually one family member who's carrying the majority of the responsibilities. So part of our role is to really help the caregiver to assess, you know, what is your network of support and what are the assets that you can pull on to really support you in this caregiving journey. So we'll convene a family consultation. We also offer wellness opportunities in addition to joint enrichment experiences, which are opportunities for, you know, the caregiver and their loved one to continue to have enriching experiences together. All of this, though, is done in a way, you know, we want to increase the capacity of the caregiver to better support the person, their loved one, but then we also want to do exactly this and increase the capacity of the community and raise awareness. PSS has a dementia-friendly communities initiative, and a critical piece of that, a defining feature of that model, is exactly what we're talking about here today, is to include the voices of those who are affected by dementia into that initiative, because it's only in that way that are we going to address some of the stigma that we're talking about today.
Yeah, I think that for me, it was very much, you know, the stigma is real, and I want this, I guess, to like both of you too, and it's something that you're kind of hit with like in a very super strong way, like really like right at the very beginning. And I think that it's because it's the stigma is not just kind of coming externally, it's coming internally. And so like as soon as you hear the word dementia, you know, your mind starts going into you know, into a little bit of panic mode because you know, because then all of these kind of signifiers and start to kind of like interrupt. And you know, and so I'm kind of curious about how you guys sort of feel about like the stigma of dementia, and in particular, you know, where are we really in terms of, you know, trying to like remodel the way that we sort of feel about dementia, and it's particularly with like the super like negative connotations that we have that almost kind of seem to stem from the word dementia. And I remember like when my mom kind of first got sort of a diagnosis, which was very hard to get because like dementia is not one disease, it's like, you know, 10 or 15 of them, you know, people's symptoms are different, you know, and I understand why we kind of circle them all like together a little bit. But it really was, it was hard for her to like even really kind of embrace that because there was such a, you know, it was kind of accusing somebody of like a crime, you know, and she just couldn't accept that identity for herself. And so that was just like, that was very tough.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so much of our language gets at the stigma. You know, when we say Alzheimer's victim, you know, who wants to be a victim and not Joyce Bravo? And, you know, I think the fear is real that the disease will somehow overtake every aspect of yourself and the way people view you. So I think one major thing I would love to see is us really start at a language level and realize language shapes our reality. So we talk about people with cognitive change, people with dementia. I know one physician says brain aging, and he doesn't use a lot of diagnostic language. He talks about various degrees and rapidity of brain aging on a spectrum. So I think that the words we use are very powerful. And if we can move away from victim, sufferer, and to people first language, we don't talk about people disappearing or fading away, even though some of their abilities may be disappearing. So I know that there's a lot more to say, but I would love to see just the habituation of very different language when we talk about this condition.
Yeah, because it just, I mean, it was, the word I kind of got sort of interested in, like, you know, and it took me a while to kind of like really kind of think about it, but it's, you know, doing like some research, it like the word dementia sort of, it started to be used like almost like a century ago, which in terms of like medical history is like eons ago, you know. I mean, the doctors who really kind of like came up with it were kind of thinking about like this disease very, very differently than we do today. So it seems a little bit of sort of like a relic and you know, just kind of like symbolic a little bit like of our, you know, our inability to like really kind of like move past like a kind of almost like a primordial way of like sort of like dealing like with kind of the situation. You know, I don't know. I mean, because it's you know, it's interesting to me because I think that even though it's hard, it's sometimes it feels like it's hard to kind of discuss dementia and then also like aging like in our society because we're kind of really super ageist. But you know, but I think one of the kind of the confusing things like about that kind of relationship is that aging, it's something that is kind of in front of all of us. It's something that is waiting for us, and it's something that I think that we all kind of aspire to age, and we want that identity. Like we want to sort of get old and be part of our community. And so I think it's I think it's interesting, and I think it's the work that you guys are doing are great, because I think it seems like an opportunity to like really kind of think about like how our communities can be more supportive of that process instead of vehicles for sort of like hiding that away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And a lot of what we try to do at Circle of Care is to have these conversations. So as I mentioned, we're really working to support the caregiver, but the broader community also needs tools. The broader community needs resources and information and education, and needs to have these conversations as well. I think it's also particularly timely now because we have a shifting demographic. We have an aging population. So increasingly, we're all finding ourselves in these roles. People who never have before been a caregiver are now finding themselves caring for someone who's affected by memory loss. So I think, this is incredibly timely, incredibly important. And these conversations need to be happening at the individual level, but then at the much broader community level as well.
Yeah, and just, and I mean, we're not avoiding sort of talking about like the quarantine, and so I think that it's also, we just have to recognize and just sort of like pay our respects that I think that like this quarantine is just disproportionately like, the brunt of it is like being carried by people with dementia in this community. Those things that we find like annoying about like being stuck in our house, about having to wear masks, about having disruptions in our routine, about having even less access to the outside world. Like, I mean, it's just, it's grueling to kind of think about like what the experience of this quarantine is like for people with dementia who are already like sort of stretched kind of thin on that, and so it does kind of seem like, a wake-up call, hopefully, for ourselves that, that this might, hopefully that this is an opportunity to sort of gather people around, around an issue and really kind of and start to like address some of the structural issues that we know are there. Like we know that these problems exist, and that maybe we need to sort of figure out a way to kind of start diverting some like resources to kind of like helping these, helping this out and helping reconnect this community in some way.
Yeah, I think that's so important. You mentioned that, Chris. It's always in the backdrop of any of these conversations. Not only are people much more isolated, but they're dying at much faster rates. Mm-hmm. People in institutions and people with Alzheimer's diagnosis. And the stats say 90% of people want to grow older and stay in their homes. Well, if that's true, then can we create that world in which that's possible? If 90% of us don't want to leave our neighborhoods when we get sick or when we need a lot of care. So how do we go about creating that? I love PSS Circle of Care, that dementia inclusive community model, and others are working on that. But, we build the world we want to create. And I hope this pandemic is kind of a portal that we walk through and, create, because a dementia inclusive community is more inclusive for all of us. Yeah. So not just people with cognitive change. I want that too.
Yeah, and I mean, if people have questions, they should definitely like enter them into the chat, because I'm kind of curious about sort of who is here, because we can't really see you guys. But you should definitely feel like if you have questions to ask, that you can kind of like pipe in and ask it. But and I think that that working around like this community, I mean, I think it's one of those kinds of situations that's true in like lots of different kinds of like civil rights movements, is that that doing that work, it's not limited to sort of like just helping people who are aging or with dementia is that doing that kind of work, it actually serves to like integrate our communities across the board into like into like wouldn't it be better to like have communities architected so that that spaces can be more multi-generational. Like we would all benefit from having that happen. And so it's sort of thinking about the sort of this one kind of particular example, I think kind of probably gives like ideas to a whole like slew of issues and places to kind of like focus on. Yeah.
My father had dementia and my mother was his primary caregiver. And I remember at a certain point, she couldn't leave him home alone. So she would bring him to the grocery store, and going to the grocery store was such an incredibly anxiety provoking experience for her. And I think that just speaks to one small component of our everyday lives. We go to the grocery store, but all of a sudden something so simple becomes such a difficult thing, because I think we need to affect so much change in our communities, because people need to be more informed, because we want to live in these inclusive communities. And that really struck me. And I think just made me more motivated to pursue this sort of dementia friendly community, inclusive community work, right? Because I see the need,
Yeah. And, we can start wrapping up, but I just, make it seem a little bit sort of like free flowing, but I think kind of like early in my sort of like research and kind of like putting together, doing, starting to do this work. And, I'm not trained in it at all. Like you guys have, have been thinking about this like, for a while, but especially coming to as a filmmaker and like a kind of a filmmaker sort of, you can't think about making a film without also kind of thinking about building an audience around it. And I was talking to this amazing woman. She's a journalist who actually specializes in the aging population. And so and so I was telling her about my film, and she was very supportive, but she also sort of says like, good luck with that, because like these are ideas that people just don't really sort of want to sort of think about, and they're definitely not going to like watch a film that's about this, because you want to kind of, and so I think that I think like that Lynn's book, I think also kind of wrestles with that, and it's like how do we sort of talk about these issues and kind of like remove it from like this kind of cloak of like sort of like dread, and actually be able to kind of like have a conversation around it that's not just like immediately like sort of like threatening and off-putting to people, and that this doesn't have to be a scary, painful kind of conversation to have. It can actually be like it can even include a lot of like fun. And one of like, I got on TikTok a few months ago, just because when it was kind of TikTok was blowing up amongst people my age. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to do it. But one of the interesting things that I found on there's actually like a fairly sizable caregiver community on TikTok. And they have like found that there is an aspect of dementia that is like pure humor, and that their loved ones are hilarious. They're hilarious, and they're kind, and they're caring, and they love to sing and dance and have wild conversations, and so it was really great to sort of like see people really kind of like recognizing that there's other ways to kind of think about this, and there's other ways that we can sort of like come together and sort of like honor our loved ones, through this kind of process. And so I thought that was kind of like powerful. It actually looks like we have a question. Oh yeah, so Mindy has a question, and it's really like, it's about, I think, a little bit of the flip side of like what we were sort of discussing about like having caregivers be supported from the outside, but there's also a way that kind of caregivers might entrench in their role as caregivers. Like, and so I don't know if everybody can see it. It can be overwhelming and fulfilling for the caregiver, but also they can get protective of the person with memory loss in a way that closes out the other family members who want to be involved in caring and in giving caregiver time away. and this is from a sister who's been having trouble with a brother-in-law who's been sort of like restricting involvement, like with this person's sister. And I, you know, like Sonja, you, and also like Lynn, you probably have much more sort of direct experience, but I think that this is definitely something that sounds familiar to me, and some stories that I've heard anecdotally from people.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the biggest things, one of the most important things a caregiver can do is give themselves permission to take a break. And I think that's hard sometimes for a myriad of reasons. They may feel like they can't take a break. There may be guilt associated with it, or in this instance, they may be very protective, and they want to control the responsibility and how that person is cared for. But I think it's that old saying: you have to put your oxygen mask on before you put it on the person beside you. The point is, if I, as a caregiver, have nothing left to give, how can I be the best in my role? So, it's again, really encouraging folks to reach out and access that support that is available to them. But oftentimes that requires a conversation, and sometimes that requires a conversation facilitated by someone who is objective and not outside of that family, oftentimes I would say it does. But I really think, regardless of the caregiving role you're in, you need to take that time for yourself. You need to give yourself permission to do that.
For sure. And I think one of the, especially when caregivers are also family members, that, it's not like your relationships, then all of a sudden, like you hit the reset button, you know what I'm saying? And so you're taking a whole lifetime of issues and communication and relationships like into this process, and I, if there was one, and so I think in a certain sense, I think that thinking about like those, about like what happens when you have a family member who becomes in need of more care and support, like I think it then sort of like ripples into, an imperative of like, let's go into that situation with strong families, you know what I'm saying? Strong relationships, like a strong understanding, like an openness with each other. And I think the more strength that you can kind of go into that with, like, it's going to kind of carry you through that situation. Like if you have open communication, you've got trust, that it becomes like so much more important. Like if you're not feeling like you're trusting the people around you, like dementia it can wreak havoc, there's, even like with my own mom, it was very, she would, it's easy to sort of dismiss it as sort of like, oh, being paranoid or being angry. But the problem was that there was like, what she was saying was sort of true, and so she would get very frustrated and upset with me and just going like, you're trying to come in and take over my life. And I would be like, well, kind of, like that, yes. Like, there like, we do need to like, rethink about, the car and your living situation and having, a home health aide come into the house. And so it was, as always with dementia, that it's easy to kind of, too easily kind of push it into sort of like a mental illness kind of situation, because it's easier to do that than actually kind of start to listen to like what that person is saying to you, and kind of understand, that they are, not perfectly, and maybe not logically, maybe not grammatically, but like really kind of trying to like express the way that they feel. And that a lot of times it can come out and sound like anger, and it can sound like paranoia, but I think it's hard not to understand that those are real feelings, and so it's definitely challenging, because I think that that kind of caregiving situation has a tendency to sort of bring a lot of that up. Yeah. Cool. I don't know, does somebody have anything else to say, or should we? Cool. Well, okay. So I guess we can wrap up if nobody has any more questions. You know, I just would like to thank again Lynn and Sonja for agreeing to come and sort of share some of their thoughts and work that they've been doing around this issue. And you know, I think yeah, I mean, I think that it is kind of an exciting moment, because it seems like there is a really kind of a great community of amazing people who are kind of thinking about these issues and really kind of trying to push forward on it in these different ways. And so hopefully, you know, hopefully that's a good sign that you know, that maybe kind of there is sort of a you know, a broad interest to kind of you know, kind of move this a little bit more into the mainstream. And so thanks again to you guys for coming and generously donating your time. And thanks again to Allason for hosting us.
Yeah, I want to thank you all. Thank you so much. It's been a very interesting and thought-provoking conversation. So I really appreciate you all taking the time.
Thank you so much for hosting. And Chris, thank you so much for the opportunity. Yeah. Lynn, so nice to meet you.
Yeah, it's so good to be together. And thank you all. Thank you, Chris, for a beautiful film, piece of art that will live with us a long time.
All right. Thank you, guys. Have a good night.
Ciao.
Thank you.
Thank you.